How you doing, folks? My name is Andrew Devine. Welcome along to the third episode of the Divine Message and the first one for 2026. If you enjoy this little rant of mine, please hit the like and subscribe button. Be much appreciated. And this episode is not going to be about politics, but about the topic of addiction and the prevailing attitudes in Western culture towards how addiction is classified and how best to treat it. I'm going to be speaking quite a bit from personal experience here, because it's 29 years this year since I last drank alcohol or took any illegal drugs. Now, if I still attended 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, which I haven't done for over 20 years, I'd be getting a clap on the back if I still attended those groups for being what they would classify me as sober or clean and still being in recovery. However, I don't define myself as sober or clean. I'm merely a teetotaler. And I'm not in recovery because that term for me presupposes that I buy into the disease theory of addiction, which I no longer do. I reject terms for myself like sober, clean, in recovery because one of the reasons is I don't believe in defining myself in opposition to a negative pattern of behavior from nearly 30 years ago in my life. I find all of these terms to be negative and disempowering for me. I'm fine. I have friends who attend 12-step groups and they use these terms. That works for them. That helps them, and that's fine. I'm just giving my take on why I no longer buy into any of that. And also, don't get me wrong, conquering my compulsive and obsessive relationship with alcohol and drugs was one of the best things I've ever done, but my entire identity isn't wrapped up in it any longer. So in this video, I want to offer a critique of the disease models of addiction and the 12-step recovery groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous that promulgate the disease theory of addiction. And I just want to stress that I'm going to be fair towards the 12-step groups, and I'm going to point out what I think they get right and how they did help me. So I want to be balanced, but I'm also going to criticize a lot that I think is wrong with their approach, as well as the good aspects. Now, the disease theory of addiction is actually still promoted by much of the medical and scientific community, far from all within the medical scientific community, but still quite a lot, and it's the prevailing view amongst a lot of them. And most rehabs in the English-speaking world promote the theory, and they only offer 12-step frameworks to help people overcome addiction. I'm currently reading this book about addiction by former drug addict and professor of neuroscience Mark Lewis. It's entitled The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease. I'm about 50 pages into the book, and I agree with much of what I've read so far because it chimes with my own intuitions and thought processes around addiction, in which he gives more of a neuroscientific analysis of addiction, along with case studies and his own experiences. And a lot of what he says, like I said, chimes with my own intuitions and thoughts I've had. I'm going to offer a review of that book in another video, and I'll put a link to an article that was in the New York Post that kind of surmises his basic theory and findings from science, from neuroscience in relation to addiction. So one of my main issues with the disease models of addiction is that it completely overlooks the role of personal responsibility in how addiction comes about in the first place. Of course, I recognize that some people, due to negative environmental factors such as poverty or trauma from childhood, that those people, and I was one of them, are far more prone to addiction. But there's also plenty of other people who have had very similar traumatic experiences in their childhood or come from poor backgrounds, and they don't choose to use addictive substances to escape unpleasant realities. And also, there's a lot of addiction in middle class areas, particularly cocaine and alcohol, and so it can't be reduced to poverty or even to dysfunctional families. It's a complex area. Anyway, I want to talk about personal responsibility. So the abandonment of personal responsibility, that's been a defining feature of Western culture since so-called progressive values became dominant in the second half of the 20th century. And I believe that feeds into a lot of our approaches to addiction in the modern Western world. A case in point would be the Scottish government in the last few years have promoted this absurd public health campaign in which they try to promote the idea that alcohol and drug addiction are health conditions, without mentioning the fact that choosing to get off one's head on a regular basis leads to that health condition. Sure, like I said, if you get off your head too frequent a basis, you will run the risk of developing addiction and negative health outcomes. But like I said, the Scottish government failed to point out that, say, unlike a health condition such as multiple sclerosis or being born with a club foot, you can avoid the health condition of being an alcoholic or drug addict by simply laying off Buckfast tonic wine or whiskey, not smoking crack or super strength cannabis on a daily basis. So to illustrate why I think their Scottish government's policy gone ridiculous, I'm going to reference an unflattering period from my own life. From my mid-20s, from my mid-teens into my early 20s, I lived a very hedonistic lifestyle, and I engaged very heavy drinking from a very young age, often solitary, and later went on to be a daily cannabis user. And I mean, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep. And I dabbled in other drugs when I could get my hands on them, particularly speed, because it allowed me to drink massive quantities of alcohol, and I liked that kind of up feeling that I got from it. I did all of this to escape feelings of extreme anxiety due to childhood conditioning and negative experiences. So I was self-medicating, as they often say in the psychology community, and I was more prone to addiction than a lot of other people. Because some people are more psychologically primed for addiction. I definitely was, but that doesn't negate the fact that I only became addicted and dependent by repeatedly choosing to consume addictive substances in large quantities. And just like many others whose childhood left them with issues, I could have taken up being obsessive about sport or some other form of escape, or channeled that anxious energy into making sure that I was the best I could be at school, so that I went on to, ensure that I had a great career upon leaving school. I could have channeled it into more perfectionistic behaviors, if that makes any sense. But I didn't. And the simple reason is that alcohol and drugs, when I discovered them, they gave me intense feelings of euphoria and immediate escape from a lot of the anxiety that I had. And I really enjoyed getting completely off my head, because the positive aspects for the first few years outweighed the negative effects. That said, from a very early on in my teens, when I started drinking, I had a gnawing feeling all the time that I was way too fond of alcohol, because I had problems controlling it from the start, but I still chose to keep consuming it, because when it was working to leave my anxiety, I found it irresistible. Now, by the time I quit, I was a daily drinker, drug user. And once you're into very extreme problematic drinking and drug use, it comes with feelings of guilt and shame due to the harm that you're doing to yourself, your family, and to wider society. Addiction can indeed seem like an illness because it does come with a loss of control, and negative physical health outcomes, and it involves people compromising their own moral boundaries that they had before addiction. And however, all these negative effects are the result, again, of repetitive drug or alcohol use. So even if you accept that alcohol or drug addiction is an illness of sorts, it's one of the few illnesses that can be completely avoided or remedied by behavioral choices, including when you're completely immersed in addiction. After all, a part of the much talked about rock bottom that addicts and alcoholics experiences, that rock bottom is followed by a decision to stop drinking and or taking drugs. And because of that, because of my own rock bottom, which propelled me, there were several rock bottoms in fact, but they got me to quit because I wanted to quit. And it was not very easy, but the pain of continuing to do and live that kind of lifestyle was too much for me. So I quit. So I did believe I don't really deserve any praise for turning my life around, because I did so to rid myself of negative feelings associated with a worsening addiction. And I may well have continued to destroy myself with alcohol and drugs if it was still mostly a positive experience. And besides, for quite a few years after quitting, I was just as selfish and immature as I had been when I was drinking. In fact, maybe more so. And I think that's something that more than one ex-girlfriend could surely attest to. So this brings me on to sober birthday parties, and I'm going to piss off a lot of people in AA and NA with this, but I never really understood why people free of addictions for many years have anniversary parties to celebrate their abstinence. I mean, why should I be clapped on the back for not engaging in self-destructive behavior that is also socially corrosive and that harmed those closest to me? To paraphrase the American comedian Chris Rock, you're not supposed to get credit for something that you shouldn't have been doing in the first place. I mean, I've yet to meet a recovering burglar who throws a party for himself every year because he hasn't ransacked anyone's house over the last decade and expects to be praised by that, by society and his family. In my opinion, too many of us former alcoholics and drug addicts, we need to get over ourselves. We need to stop defining ourselves by addictions that are long behind us. As I said, I started drinking and drug taking for selfish reasons. I stopped for selfish reasons, and I remain abstinent for selfish reasons. Why should people celebrate that? I just want to show I'm not devoid of all compassion. I do understand giving somebody a nod of recognition and a well done and a clap on the back for getting through the initial phase of freeing oneself from a drug or alcohol dependency. Absolutely. Even more so for those who have reached the chronic stages of addiction. However, it takes a very special kind of entitled narcissism to throw a 10-year sobriety party and ask those that you've harmed throughout your addiction to applaud you on an annual basis for having ceased to be a blight in their lives. And like I said, in some instances, some former drunks and addicts are even harder to be around without chemical relief than they were when they were inebriated on a regular basis. Not all, but some. Some people, when they give up alcohol and drugs, are much more highly strung. They have a lot of anger. They have a lot of unresolved issues. The alcohol, for some people, and the drugs mellowed them out. And when they come off it, their personalities can be quite hard to be around. And I think I wasn't excessively angry, but I had a lot of issues when I stopped drinking and taking drugs. And, I was probably in some aspects more difficult to be around. It definitely was more difficult to be in a relationship with for the first few years. I can attest to that. Now, when I was quitting, I did engage with those 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotic Anonymous, who try to assist people to overcome alcohol and drug problems. And before I get more into my criticism of these groups, I want to acknowledge the positive aspects, because parts of their philosophy are definitely beneficial. For instance, many people dependent on alcohol or drugs, they find it hard to accept that they have a problem that they need to address. Denial is a big part of the psychology of addiction. And 12-step groups are quite effective at getting people to face up to the fact that they have a drug or alcohol problem in the first place. And I also believe their emphasis on abstinence is probably the surest way to break the addictive cycle and to prevent falling back into addiction. It's what's worked for me. I would not trust myself to drink or take illegal drugs. I don't want to, but I wouldn't trust myself to do it in the first place. Because my experience is that I couldn't control it, no matter how much I tried, and that was when I was much younger. There's also a lot to be admired in their desire that you make amends to people that your actions have harmed, and in helping others who are dependent on alcohol or drugs to quit. And also they're big on trying to improve yourself and dealing with character defects in yourself, being a more productive member of society, contributing more to the world and getting over yourself. They are good at that, at promoting that. It doesn't always work out that way in there, but they are good at them. They're the positive aspects of 12-step groups, and there's many very well-intentioned, decent people in those groups. And I still have some friends, maybe I won't have them after this video, but I still have some friends in those groups and areas that I'd agree with them on. However, there's much in the 12-step philosophy that is deeply flawed. They, like I've talked about before, they promote the idea that my problem drinking, compulsive drug use, or anybody's, is due to having an illness. And the 12-step ideologies assert that the disease of addiction actually never leaves you. Even when you're abstinent, you're never a fully recovered alcoholic or addict. You're always recovering. To me, this is very disempowering. It's like telling someone who was confined to a wheelchair but can now walk that they'll always really be a cripple, and they need to go to meetings every day for the rest of their lives and talk incessantly and listen to others talk incessantly about how awful it was to be a cripple, because if they don't do that, then one day they'll intentionally make themselves crippled all over again. I just don't agree with that, and that's what AA is like for me. And what's more, according to 12-step groups, your state of perpetual recovering, it can only be maintained by surrendering your will and life to a God of your own understanding and through working the steps. That involves, like I said, attending meetings every week for the rest of your life. And it's repeatedly preached at AA meetings that to cease attending the meetings or working the program, as they call it, that guarantees you a return to addiction. They kind of have a monopoly on treating addiction. There's one or 2 points in their big book, as they call it, that say they don't have a monopoly, but that they contradict themselves throughout that book. And in meetings, they assert that this is the only effective way to remain long-term abstinent from alcohol and drugs. And none of this, in my view, is a message of emancipation from addiction. It's merely swapping a dependency on chemicals for a dependency on ideological group conformity. A guy in an AA meeting once told me that if you can stay off the booze for life at these meetings, listening to all the whiners, along with the sanctimonious self-appointed gurus, then you'll be able to get through anything in life. And indeed, I found that to be part of my experience. Also, if as AA and the Scottish government insist, if my alcohol dependency was a disease or an illness, why do 12-step groups insist that I must make amends to those I've harmed? Is this not a tacit admission that addiction is to some extent the result of a moral failing? Because no one would expect, say, somebody who was blind to make amends for accidentally knocking over something when they're visiting your house. Sure, once people are addicted, they engage in behavior that goes against their moral compass when under the influence, or when craving the next hit. An addiction comes with a loss of control. However, unlike, say, the blind person that I referenced, the addict can choose to fight to overcome their plight, as many former addicts, such as myself, can testify. And even when fully immersed in addiction, there's always an element of choice, whether to repeatedly use addictive substances that altered your behavior over time. Because that's what the rock bottom that I referenced is earlier. The rock bottom is a point when you go, I've had enough, and I'm going to choose to not do this anymore, as difficult as it can be. So unlike the process of going blind or being born with any congenital disease, my disease of addiction resulted from repeated trips to the off-license and repeated visits to various drug dealers over several years. In other words, going blind is a passive process in which the genuine victim has zero agency, but developing and acquiring the disease of addiction involves quite a lot of agency, particularly in the early stages. I'm not acknowledging that there isn't loss of control, like I said, but agency is a factor in a way that it isn't in other illnesses. Not that I accept addiction as an illness, but for argument's sake. Another thing in AA, they have this expression, there but for the grace of God go I, and it's a popular aphorism at these meetings, and it's used with reference to those who've had a relapse and return to drinking, taking drugs. I mean, this to me, the idea that God is keeping you, only God keeps you sober, and dependence on God. There's nothing wrong with having spirituality or religion. I'm not critiquing that, but to me it's a complete inversion of the Judeo-Christian concept that man is bestowed with free will by this creator, and that he must take conscious responsibility for his own actions. I mean, the Scottish government have clearly imbibed that very disputed notion promulgated by AA and other 12-step groups that addiction is a disease. And like I said, many in the medical and psychology establishment, they promulgate that notion too. But forgive me if I don't blindly accept every word from a set of disciplines in which many believe men can magically turn themselves into women. Also, the Scottish government's campaign says that people should receive help and support, not judgment. Let's end the stigma of addiction. And the campaign also says that people shouldn't be referred to as alcoholics or addicts, but rather as persons with problematic drug or alcohol use. I mean, even 12-step groups like AA who push the disease model of addiction, they don't go even as far as negating all personal responsibility by speaking about addiction as it's something that just happened to you, like a ladder falling on you while you're walking down the street. I mean, I wasn't a person with problematic drug or alcohol use. I was someone who actively enjoyed getting drunk and high and did so with such regular frequency that I eventually developed a dependency on it. I mean, what have the Scottish government got to say about those of us for whose stigma and shame, a degree of it, helped us quit? Because for me, feeling like a total loser who could barely look himself in the mirror is what spurred me on to change. When I was cleaning up my act, it would have been really solipsistic, self-centered of me to demand that the people that I had affected negatively through my drinking, that they make no judgments of my behavior, and that they should have been there solely to offer me support. Now, as I'm opposed to any kind of authoritarianism, I've no desire for the state to take a punitive approach in dealing with drug and alcohol addiction. Sure, be punitive in dealing with crimes that result from it. I have no problem with that. But, I don't really agree with punishing people simply for taking these drugs or alcohol or abusing alcohol. Because as history has shown us, prohibition in America was a dismal failure, and the war on drugs has been. But I would prefer a return to a culture, bottom up, a culture that emphasizes and promotes personal restraint and that views both habitual drunkenness and drug abuse as personal failings. Because in my own case, it was awareness of the social stigma, because there still was, and there still is some, not as much as there should be, but there still is some, and that social stigma that still exists to an extent, along with well-intentioned judgment from others close to me, that imbued me with the conscience that in the end helped me to effect the change that I needed to in my life. The Scottish government really need to revise their approach to tackling addiction, because at the moment you'd actually get more sense into the reality of the issue of addiction from Scotland's fictional TV alcoholic philosopher King Ramsay Nesbitt TV show from the 90s, or even from the violent sociopath Begbie from the film Trainspotting. They make more sense in their view of addiction. Those dysfunctional fictional characters make much more sense than the numpties in the Scottish government. Anyway, I'll leave that one. I wonder how many friends I've lost in the 12-step groups from this video, but thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. And once again, I'd highly recommend this book, The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, by Mark Lewis. And I'll see you again for another topic soon. Thank you.